Hello, I'm Sue Beardsmore, and on behalf of ACAP, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar. It's designed to help you deal with the explosion of online fraud that's been provoked by the uncertainties and events caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. The Association of Certified Accounts Payable Professionals is an integral part of the Institute of Financial Operations and Leadership, better known as IFOL. We offer world-class qualification, research and support to a global community of financial operations professionals, including P2P, accounts payable, accounts receivable, payroll, and shared services. And our mission is to make learning and development accessible to all financial operations professionals globally. Well, today I'm delighted we're joined by someone at the forefront of the fight against the fraudsters, Alex Beavan, Head of Fraud Investigation at Western Union Business Solutions. There's no need to take notes. The webinar will be available on the ACAP website, and a link to the slide deck with all the information will be sent to everyone who's signed up. If you have any questions, please do send them in via the question box. Alex, welcome. There are so many reports of new frauds being carried out. What should businesses and individuals be looking out for? And crucially, what can they do to mitigate the threat of online fraudsters?
Thank you very much, Sue, and thank you for the invite. What I wanted to do today is go through, as you've asked, how to mitigate the risk of fraud. And, particularly whilst we're in this sort of situation with regard to the pandemic, it's very important now to sort of go through the types of fraud that we're seeing, but also stress the underlying methodologies and typologies that we see, because when we're talking about companies, when we're talking about legal companies, there is an inherent risk with regard to such frauds as business email compromise. And it's very important that we cover off that, because, as I say, much of the fraud that we see has its roots in business email compromise. So, when we talk about fraud and businesses, it is a big problem. There is a very great corporate risk out there in relation to especially international transactions involving businesses. Now, you'll see on the screen, I provided some figures which some of you may already know, and these are figures in relation to business email compromise, and they are pretty much the most defined figures that I can find. We have seen talk of in the last sort of year in the US, particularly, there's been over $1.7 billion worth of fraud in relation to companies. But look at the screen, you'll see I'm talking about $26.2 billion worth of fraud in relation to business and business email compromise in particular. Now, I think it's very important to point out that is the reported figure, and that is a reported figure to the FBI. When we talk about global, you have to remember as well that a lot of firms do not report these sort of frauds. There's sort of statistics in the UK that would suggest that only 4% of fraud is reported. A lot of reasons why fraud is not reported is reputational. Firms also believe that there's no point reporting it if they're not covered by insurance, and business email compromise is one of those types of fraud where insurance is very rarely offered. And the other thing as well is, as I say, because they're not going to get any payout with regard to it, is there any need to report it to law enforcement as well? So, this is the reported figure. The true figure is much higher. And as you can see as well, we're dealing with increases year on year. The 2018, 100% increase. But because of the fact that there is a lot of fraud, because of the fact it's taken very seriously by law enforcement, the likes of the FBI and ourselves and other sort of firms, you can learn how to mitigate the risk, particularly of this type of fraud. And I've put on the screen as a little bit of an indicator as to where the sort of nexus is. And Hong Kong and China, the FBI used to talk about 25% of all these sort of cases. In the first instance, the money will go to Hong Kong and China, and the people behind it, there's been a number of arrests in Nigeria by the FBI over the last couple of years in Operation Wire and Operation Rewired. So you can start to see from that, just for those from work by the FBI, that there is the ability to mitigate the risk. And what I want to do today is actually go through that. Now, because we're in a pandemic, it's very important to point out what are the sort of frauds we're seeing during the pandemic. And I've got some figures for you as the latest sort of retort as to how much fraud has taken place. And as you can see on the screen, The US are talking about over 100 million that's been reported. In the UK, over 5 million, and Canada we have a figure for as well. But again, I would stress that this is reported crime. The reality of this is there's much more fraud taking place during the pandemic. And the other thing I want to say at this point is, when we talk about the fraud that has taken place during the pandemic, yes, there is a certain type of fraud that's happening. But to give you an example of where the fraud that we see on a normal day-to-day basis with regard to businesses has been slightly adapted for the purposes of COVID-19, you can see, what I'm talking about. One example I wanted to give at this stage is a fraud that takes place with regard to business email compromise. One of the red flags, which I'll go through a little bit later, is the reason given for changing the beneficiary details. During COVID-19, the fraudsters were giving the reason that the bank manager had died because of the virus, and therefore you need to send your money to a different bank account. That's what I mean with regard to, it's still business email compromise, but there's a COVID-19 flavor to it.
Yeah, so things have changed slightly, but it's still the same as it ever was. And your department at Western Union has wide experience of all types of online fraud, even before this pandemic, hasn't it? So tell us about that.
Yeah, I think we're in a fortunate position because we are doing international transactions for businesses across 200 territories and countries, that we are seeing a very mixed sort of flavor as to how these sort of offences take place. And by one of my position, investigating all the fraud that comes through, I am probably in a good position to be able to report back on the sort of fraud we've seen during COVID-19 and particularly business email compromise. So as I say, we're very much across the globe, and you must remember the business email compromise is about international transactions. We do see instances where the transaction will stay in country. You can have the client in the country, so the legal firm in the country. The transaction they're doing will be to someone else in the country, and the beneficiary payment may be changed to another bank, say in the US. So it doesn't always mean that it's going from one side of the world to the other. It very much depends on where it's sort of situated. But as I say, I work for Western Union Business Solutions. So in the last a few years, I've been working very much on business email compromise and COVID-19 fraud, unfortunately. So, we are very aware of the type of fraud that is happening across the globe. I keep my contacts with law enforcement as well. I did 30 years there. So I'm sort of very up to date with regard to what we're seeing. Unfortunately, as I say, we're dealing with fraud across 200 countries, and we deal with 37,000 business clients, and there's very much a variety through that with regard to the cases that we see, and that's very much dictates the mitigation I want to talk about today with regard to how clients can deal and mitigate the risk of these sort of frauds.
So what types particularly of fraud are being brought to your attention now, both the business as usual from the fraudsters, but also taking notice of the pandemic, taking advantage of the pandemic?
Well, it's a good point you asked there with regard to the different types. That we've managed to sort of badge it into 5 different fields, and I've sort of given a nominal title with regard to it. And the first one I want to deal with is the fake goods. Now, when I talk about goods, I mean any sort of transaction, any sort of it could be a transaction with regard to dealing with a contract. It could be a transaction with regard to buying PPE, and obviously we've seen a lot of that during this crisis. We've seen firms that have never been involved in the medical field have been dealing with, say, antique furniture, and have suddenly decided they're going to buy PPE. So it could be anything and everything with regard to a transaction. That's the most important thing, transactions that take place. But during the pandemic, it's been more about goods, and obviously we've seen the issue with regards to supply lines. The other thing I wanted to talk about is investment opportunities. We've had issues with regard to banks that have not been able to actually work during the pandemic because people have been working from home. So we've had companies that have been looking for different investment opportunities, and therefore, they move into the realms of what the fraudsters are expecting. And it's very important to remember as well, fraudsters are very dynamic in their approach. They're prepared for this. They're very experienced, and they are in the space that companies are going to move into. The other one, which we've lived through for many years since the internet was invented, is malicious emails. We all see them on a day-to-day basis on our own accounts. But the important thing here is malicious emails is the prelude to business email compromise. I want to cover that off. And the final two is very much around the pandemic, fake charities and fake funding, because a lot of firms are, they realize this is a humanitarian crisis, and a lot of firms have made contributions to charities, or tried to make contributions to charities, but also a lot of firms are being scammed in relation to this. So what I'm going to do is actually go through these stage by stage and show you how you can mitigate the risk of these particular sort of fraud. So the first one I'm going to deal with is fake goods, and the important thing to do here is remember that this is very much a business email compromise situation. We have situations where firms are trying to make purchases, with regard to their normal business. And as I say, it could be with regard to buying computers, it could be with regard to buying equipment for, in relation to their normal trade. But we're in a situation where supply lines have been affected. There's more competition for goods, or they could be buying PPE. So firms are going onto the internet. They're pressured. We're in a pressured situation with regard to businesses. Businesses are trying to keep their head above water. So they're going onto the internet to do transactions. They're in a situation where they may have to just do an open source search, and I'll go into that in a moment. But they're going onto the internet to try and find a new supplier. And that is what the fraudsters are waiting for. They are already out there. They've already created their websites. They've already created the product, or details with regard to the product. They've already got their accounts ready. They're waiting for you as a firm to go into their space. And what we also have seen in this sort of environment is that firms, as I say, are being pressured because they're being convinced that there is supply issues. They're also being convinced by the fraudsters that there's supply issues. So they will go onto these websites, and they will fall into the trap of effectively doing a transaction because they feel pressured, and they will be pressured by the fraudsters themselves, but they've ignored all those fantastic approval processes they had in place pre the pandemic. So what we've seen is a situation where a lot of companies are being scammed by the fraudsters because of websites that these fraudsters have created. So, we see this happen time and time again, unfortunately, despite the risk. But there is easy ways to actually mitigate the risk of these sort of frauds. I'll go into business email compromise a little bit later, because that's much more expansive in terms of the red flags and things to see. But in dealing with the fake goods situation, some of these are common sense, but we always need to remind ourselves with regard to them is that you should only be dealing with a firm that is a confirmed supplier. And when I talk about confirmed, is do you know a business that has been successful buying product from this particular website, this particular company? And I've been dealing with one today where we're in a situation where it is a new supplier, and it's clear that there is an issue with regard to whether enough due diligence has been done. So you've got to deal with someone that you are happy and it's been confirmed either by your own research, or it's because you know someone who's actually transacted. And it's not a case of someone who's come forward to you. It's someone that from many years of business is legitimate. The other thing I'd say is, you can make the internet work for you. Whereas we had the situation I'm talking about where the fraudsters are on the internet waiting for you, you can turn the table and you can use open source. And when I say open source, it's pretty much the case of, if you imagine everything that's on the internet and is freely available, that is open source. So you could go onto a search engine, and as simply as putting the details of the company and the word scam into Google search, whatever it may be, and see what you get back. It's something as simple as that. We have dealt with a couple of cases in the last 6 months where we were in a position to do the due diligence on behalf of the client, or we pointed them in the direction how to do it, and a simple search like that was able to stop the transaction before it became a business email compromise. Something as simple. There's people out there who are making records of firms that are scamming other people. The other thing is, there are sites out there that can help you understand what you're facing. Now, with regard to fraud, these people that are trying to do fraud are popping up and then disappearing as quickly as possible. They don't want to be there too long because they get caught out by law enforcement. So they will create a website, which when you get to it will probably be only a month or two old. So you can go onto a website like Whois, It's a registration website with regard to websites that are out there. And you can search a website and you can see when that website was registered. So if you go on there and you're dealing with a company and you go and search their website, and that website's been there and there for 6 or 7 years, and you see they've been registered with Companies House or another company registration agent, whichever country you're in, and they've been registered for a number of years, that gives you a level of assurance that you're dealing with a legitimate company. If you go on the registration site with regard to the website and you find that the website was created, 2 days ago, I would say that, you have to be very wary that this hasn't just been created for the purpose of fraud. It's about reassurance. You'll never have the definitive answer. You can't ask someone, is this fraud or isn't it fraud? You have to do the due diligence. And these are simple ways to give you the level of assurance whether you're dealing with a fraudster or not.
Okay.
The other thing as well is, you can search open source with regard to phone numbers and emails. You can find out whether that phone number is associated to that company. I recently did one where I did an open source search with regard to phone number, and it came back to a Bangladesh hairdressing salon, and it was supposed to be with regard to a PPE company. So, it's again, simple stuff like that, simple searches like that can give you that assurance. And finally, if you're in any doubt with regard to what you're facing, avoid. There is other suppliers out there, and as I said, you're in a situation where if you are defrauded, can you recover that money with regard to insurance? And it very rarely happens. If we move on to investment opportunities, this is probably something very clear that there are situations where the fraudsters are creating websites again with regard to investment scams, because they know people are trying to invest their money. They know, potentially because they're not spending elsewhere, that they have a certain amount of fluidity with regard to their money, that they can invest it. And these fraudsters, this is a tried and tested method with regard to fraudsters. They've created websites out there with regard to investments, and they are encouraging people to invest their money. And you would be very surprised at how many people, time and time again, thinking that they're going to get a fantastic return when interest rates are low, that they're suddenly going to get 16, 17% return, that they are investing their hard-earned money with these companies. And again, it's very easy for the fraudsters to create something which appeals to the people out there. I've seen instances of websites where they've copied pictures from other legitimate websites. They've created all the paraphernalia, they've created the depth, but the reality is it's all fake. They've even put financial numbers on there which relate to, say, the FCA. Sorry.
I was just going to say, you've seen a lot of these websites and people need to check them, but would you say that they look convincing a lot of the time? I mean, they're offering a great deal, but they look convincing.
They look very convincing on a superficial level. I think that the thing to say, and it's a very good point you make, is that, if you look at it on the face of it, and particularly with these sort of investment scams, they will have pictures in there. They will have a literature which talks about the return. But when you start to drill down to a further, if you look at a very good website, whatever it may be, they'll have a lot of hyperlinks. They'll have a lot of points where you can press the contact button or go into the products and see it at different levels, pages and pages and pages with regard to the websites. The fraudsters don't go that far. It's almost like what we call a website shell. So it'll be one page particularly, and there may not be very much depth to it, or it'll be very much a off-the-shelf type website. If you're dealing with a very allegedly a very established company that's been around for many years, they're going to have a very glossy, very good website, which is not like ones you can buy off the shelf for £10. That's the reality. You have to look at the website, look at the depth of the website, and actually you can do research. So when I talk about the investment websites, the one case I dealt with where they had pictures on the website, and you can do a reverse search with regard to images on Google and see where those images potentially are placed elsewhere on the internet. And in that particular case, we did a reverse search on the images and found they'd been stolen from a legitimate investment website. So again, you can use open source. You can use open source with regard to Whois, again, to see when the website was established. A lot of these fraudsters will try and say that they are registered with the FCA or the other regulatory body, whichever country we're in. Again, you can go to the FCA website and see whether that's legitimate. In this particular case, I saw they produced an FCA number on their website. and you can go straight to the FCA and you see that it's actually false. So again, there is the ability to use stuff that's out there, be it government authorized, be it simple open source searches, be it search engines, where you can bring this down, where you can again get the level of insurance that is either legitimate or not. And again, what I would say is common source is always your best tool with regard to this. If it's just too unbelievable, then it's more than likely going to be a fraud. You know, we're dealing with interest rates in the UK where it's 0.1%. We're dealing with negative interest rates, I believe, in Japan. You know, we're in a situation where you're just not going to get a return of 15, 20, 30%. But that is what they're doing to entice you in. That is what it's the carrot and the stick situation. So
Right.
common sense, as I say, is your biggest tool.
Okay. And
The
then
other
we move
thing
on.
which Yeah, sorry. The other thing I wanted to cover is the malicious email situation, and this is really important. And there's a very easy way to protect yourself, and this is very much for a company and on an individual level, because companies will be getting these emails into their email box unless the software itself is weeding them out. And no matter how much your software, you still get these emails through. And the reason I want to bring up this is that there are very defined characteristics with regard to business email compromise where these sort of emails are phishing and they lead on to people having their email account compromised. Now, there is product out there which would suggest that the number of emails that are circulating around the globe with regard to malicious type acts are 6 billion a day. 6 billion emails are going out there a day which are circulating around the globe. You would have them in your own on your own phone or your own computer, and if you look in your junk box, you'll see even more. Now, the reality is that you can protect yourself. Either you have the software or you follow a simple technique, and that is not to press on any link. You'll see via the emails, they'll say, dear customer, or dear the email address. If the reality is, if it's coming from your bank or a customer or whatever, it's going to say, dear Alex Beavan, whatever it may be. It won't say dear customer. That is a computer generated situation. I'll give you an example of how this works, is that there will be a youngster sitting in his office, in his room. He'll be playing his Xbox with one hand, and he'll have 11 laptops on the floor, and they're churning out thousands and thousands and thousands of emails every minute, sending around the world, hoping that someone presses on the link. Now, eventually some people do, and eventually some people do that run a business, and then they will sell that product on to the scammers to work on. That's how it works. But you can protect yourself. Do not press on links. Clear your junk folder, and remember that effectively, if you need to check your website, be it your bank, with regard to an email because you're not certain whether it is a suspicious email or not, go to the login on your bank to see if there's a message in there. Don't respond to something in an email. Do not press on a link. That is the surefire way to end up with a phishing situation. The last two I want to show is fake charities and fake funding. Fake charities is very much a problem. We're all trying to help out with regard to this humanitarian crisis. But again, the fraudsters have created websites out there, and they're putting up images with regard to people suffering. They're putting up details with regard to how you can make a contribution, whatever sort of way they can. But they are encouraging you. They're, as I say, they're leaning on the human element of this. But again, you can use the internet to help you in these sorts of situations. But what I would say is, do not use a charity unless it's long established or an NGO, long established, and it's properly registered. Use the sites that are out there. In the UK, we have the Charities Commission, proper registered list with regard to charities, and the same applies in many countries around the world. They have proper registered lists of charities. Do not start contributing to a charity that sprung up 5 minutes ago. And finally, with regard to the types of offences we're seeing is the fake funding. You're going to see more and more of this as we move towards a sort of vaccine situation. And we've had people arrested in the UK with regard to, and convicted now, with regard to trying to sell fake vaccines in relation to the coronavirus. So again, they're going to push out links to you. They're going to push out emails to you. Again, you can use the internet to help you. But again, it's a situation with regard to do not press on any link. You know, we're in a situation where no one has a vaccine. No one has a vaccine. And if there is going to be a vaccine, it's going to be government-led. It's not going to be someone on the internet, you know, putting out adverts out there. You know, again, common sense is the biggest tool you can have with regard to these situations.
So there are a variety of scams set up specifically to do with the pandemic, and people might be looking for things online, but it sounds to me as though an awful lot of it comes through the email process. So malicious emails, emails that you're getting daily, they're the things to really look out for. And I know that you want to go through in a little bit more detail how to avoid that really particular thing.
Yeah, and this is the thing that's going to affect a company and does affect companies, whatever sector. And there's a very important point to make here. You may think that because you work in a certain you know, field, be it's education, be it's legal, whatever it may be, or you're a big company or a small company, that you may be immune from, maybe immune is not the word to use at the moment, but you may not be as vulnerable with regard to business email compromise, business email fraud. The reality is it's very indiscriminate. You know, unless you're actually being targeted by the organized criminals, you know, the business email compromise situation is such that they just target someone who has been compromised, whether they're big or small. The reality is, it's the fact that you've been compromised that brings them to your attention, not because you work in legal, not because you work in education. So if you've been compromised, you're on their radar. So what I want to talk about today is just the, you know, the blight that affects all businesses around the globe, which is business email compromise. Now, you may have heard it sort of described as CEO fraud. That's very much a name that's used in America. The reality of business email compromise is that only about 1% of these sort of frauds are involved the CEO impersonation situation. But I will go through an example of that as we go forward. You know, but in the UK, we tend to call it invoice diversion. It has a many different sort of things, but effectively it's about, as Sue talked about, emails. It's about the compromising of an email chain in relation to the transferring of funds, be they a transferring of funds to pay for a contract, be they transferring of funds to pay for a product, whatever it may be. It's about the transferring of funds. The fraudsters are trying to get you to change the details of that particular transaction so that you send the money to an account that belongs to them. Now, I'm going to take you through the various stages with regard to a business email compromise. And as I say, you know, I'm going to talk to you how to mitigate the risk, but it's very important to understand effectively the stages of business email compromise. So the first sort of stage when I talk about business email compromise is the fact that, you know, in your particular firm, it can be anyone in the firm that could be in a situation of being compromised. But usually it's the person that is actually controlling the transfer, because that is the person that has come to the attention of the fraudster. They are watching. They have compromised either your email account or your customer stroke supplier stroke person that you're working with email account, and they will wait to the point where they can move in. So they'll move in on the person that's going to make the payment. And as I say, you know, with regard to these sort of frauds, it's about changing the details. Now, it could be about changing the beneficiary name. It'll always be about changing the bank account and potentially the location. And they also talk about the reasons why. And we'll go into that with regard to the actual red flags themselves. And, you know, you get in a situation because either they have been deceived totally, or they haven't followed an approval process, or they just don't understand the red flags in relation to business email compromise that the transfer is made. So, as I said, there's various stages with regard to business email compromise. And there's 4 important stages that I want to sort of bring to your attention. And it comes back to what we talked about with regard to the frauds that we see that become very much endemic during the COVID-19 situation. Phishing, the ability for them to actually compromise the email account. You know, the numbers are rising with regard to how many business email compromise started with phishing. I saw recent material that suggested 36% and rising very rapidly. You could also be in a situation where you have spear phishing. But when I talk about phishing, it's the ability for them to have got their foot in the door with regard to compromising your email account. And it doesn't always mean with regard to a transaction it's your email account that's been compromised. It could be the other end of the chain, but they have the ability therefore to see the email that's taken place, the email chain that's taken place. Now, when they come to the point of actually wanting to sort of place their bring in their instructions into the email chain, they're going to be using the impersonation point. And that impersonation will be via email. It could be using a lookalike email address. It could be using a spoofed email address, but effectively it will be an email situation. And that email will be the last email in the email chain. So when I talk about emails, you could be working with a client in relation to whatever it is, a contract. And, that part of that contract is going to be, you sending money to this particular person. So you'll have exchanged emails over a number of months. And there will come to a point where you will ask that client, where do you want the money sent to? And they will say, can you send it to a Barclays bank account in the UK? And that is the point where the fraudster will move in. A little bit later, you'll receive an email which because of the email address that you believe it to be from the client, and he says, do you know what? Don't send it to my Barclays account. Can you send it to my HSBC account? I've just checked my Barclays account and there's an issue with regard to it. So can you send it to my HSBC account? That is how it works. It may be in the same country. It may be on the other side of the world. As I said, Hong Kong and China, 25% of the time, the money is sent when you get the instructions, the new instructions, it will be asked you to send it to that part of the world. But that is how it happens. And then you get into a situation where you may also be asked to change the beneficiary details as well. So it may be that you're dealing with a business, John Smith Limited, and then you've got the instructions as to when to send the payment, and then you receive this new email that says, look, don't send it to my Barclays account. Can you send it to my personal account at HSBC? And they'll give you a name, John Smith, whatever it may be. What you're effectively doing is sending the money to a bank account which is under the control of the fraudster. They have changed not only the bank account details, but they've changed the beneficiary as well. And you get into a situation, whatever has happened, because you've been deceived or you haven't got an approval process, so therefore you're believing of the email. And sometimes they are very believable, but the reality is, with the proper due diligence and proper understanding of the red flags, you can see this business email compromise developing. You end up sending the payment. So from our experience, there are, and this is something that I think we are the only ones that actually do with regard to the 7 red flags. I haven't seen it in any other presentation. We have developed what we call the 7 red flags of business email compromise, and this is through casework. This is through working through the cases around the globe, and we understand from those cases, what are the things that come up, time and time again. And it's not to say the 7 red flags I show you are going to come up in every case. They're going to come up in every transaction that potentially is a business email compromise that you may see, but you may see all of them. You may see one of them. But you need to be aware of them all, so that when the signs are there, you can have the suspicion and potentially, reject doing the transaction, or, as I say, and when I will show you the mitigation steps that you can take. So first and foremost, I talked about it with regard to an example, change of country with a beneficiary bank. More often than not, it's going to change. It will suddenly be start off with the UK and potentially it'll be on the other side of the world. Now you're probably thinking, why? As a fraudster, why don't you make sure it's in the same country, so that actually it's much harder to spot? Well, the reality of this is that the fraudsters have certain bank accounts out of their control. It's not certain bank accounts that they own in their own name. It's certain bank accounts that they control through potentially induced fraud. So they're working in different frauds as well. So they may have someone who is being defrauded in relation to a romance scam, and that person has a bank account in Hong Kong, and they've been told by the fraudster, who thinks they're Brad Pitt, whatever it may be, that you need to send the money. You're going to receive $50,000 into your bank account in the next few days. That's going to be for our condominium, whatever it may be. Please send it on to this bank account so that we can actually purchase the property. That's actually how it happens. So that person in Hong Kong will be expecting a payment. That payment, unfortunately, is going to be from your bank account because you have been deceived with regard to business email compromise. So that's when I talk about change of country, why it may not be in the same country. More often than not, it's going to be in another country. I talked about an example. They could ask you to change the beneficiary name as well, either to an individual or a different company name. The reality is they are trying to bat off the possibility of the confirmation of payee. Now, confirmation of payee is where a bank has the practice of checking the instructions to make sure the instructions match the name on the bank account. So when they pay the money in, it's very much a case of, in most banks, in most countries, although it has changed in the UK, in most cases, they just check the sort code and account number. In some countries, some banks will check the instructions. So if the company name on the instructions does not match the name on the bank account, then it's refused. So they may ask you to change the beneficiary name so it matches the bank account which they have under their control. The third one, which we actually see quite a lot, is, and I mentioned it at the start, is the reason given for asking you to suddenly make a change with regard to the bank account. In COVID-19, it could have been that the bank manager had died. Usually it's, our bank is suffering some sort of issue with regard to tax, or we're having a tax investigation, or we've had a bad check, therefore we've had to change the bank account. Bizarrely, this actually is a very good indicator of business email compromise, because a normal business will probably just not say, they'll probably say, for business reasons, we've changed our bank account. The fraudsters seem to think they have to work very hard to convince you to change the instructions, and they come up from some very weird excuses as to why they suddenly had to change the bank account details. The fourth one is the email address. If you look at the email address, more often than not, it's going to be a lookalike email address. So it won't be the same email address as your client, your customer had in the previous emails. It'll be very similar, may have an extra I or a hyphen in it. So it's very important when you get into a situation where you're asked with regard to changing beneficiary details, beneficiary bank, to look at the email address. Yes, they can be spoofed, but more often than not, the fraudsters use a completely different email address or a lookalike email address. The final three red flags, again, very important. We see from our research that, when we're talking about business email compromise, it doesn't mean that the fraudsters are all in the same country. They'll be all over the world. We've seen cases where the fraudsters are sitting in a cafe in Nigeria and sending out the emails to the other side of the world. It may be that English is not their first language. It may be that they're copy and pasting email chains from real legitimate emails and putting it in their email, because obviously they're sending it from a different email account, and therefore they make mistakes. So where you may have been conversing with your customer and client, and it's a case of, it's very personal in terms of, it's hi this or whatever, they may go to the ABC of writing emails and it suddenly becomes dear, or or you signed off yours sincerely. So have a look at that. The other thing is the invoice. Look at the invoice, the new invoice that you sent compared to the old one. You may be in a situation where you can spot the difference in terms of the banking instructions. The old invoice will be perfect in terms of the font. The new invoice may be different in terms of the font around the banking instructions. So have a look at the banking instructions on the new invoice. And finally, we find that the fraudsters, and it's clear why they do it, is because they don't want to get caught either by compliance or law enforcement. They will put pressure on you to make these changes and send out the transaction. And finally, what do you need to do with regard to protecting yourself? You need to have an approval process. You very much have to have an approval process. And the best example I say about having an approval process is the CEO fraud itself. Is you'll have the fraudsters pretending to be your CEO, and they'll send an email from your, it looks like they're sending it from your CEO's account, and they'll send it to you and say, can you make a transaction to this new beneficiary, please? Can you send $50,000 to such and such? Now, you're probably thinking, well, it's come from the CEO, I better not, bother him with regard to the transaction. No, that's what the fraudsters want you to do. It's a human, business email compromise relies on the human element. What you need to do is have an approval process where you actually check with the CEO with regard to the instructions. You have to, it's a situation like that, you have to actually contact them. And it's the same, when I say contact, it's about picking up the phone. It's the same with regard to your client. If your client has sent you new beneficiary instructions, you've got to pick up the phone and phone them and say, did you send me these instructions? But you mustn't use anything that's in the email that's just been sent to you, which is potentially fraudulent. So any contact details in that email could be new contact details provided by the fraudster. And therefore you have to go back to your records to know, you've got to keep good records with regard to this as to, your client, which number do you know is certainly his, phone it up and say, did you send me these new banking instructions? And it comes on to the point I say on the screen, never trust the contents of the email. And also, as I say, keep good records of your customers and your suppliers, because you'll never know when you're going to need that number where you can't trust the new number that's in an email. And those are sort of, points with regard to actually how to protect your business. It's very much about communication. It's as simple as that. I read a report recently where it was about 60 odd pages about business email compromise, and it got to this the last page, and it said the secret of taking down business email compromise, and it said pick up the phone. That is a reality with regard to business email compromise. If you can communicate with your supplier, your customer by phone and say, did you send me these instructions, you can bring down these business email compromise, and that is part of your approval process.
Right. So, Alex, do you think that things have got so much worse during the pandemic, partly because people are under pressure, partly because they're working from perhaps home in different circumstances, and maybe tempted to cut corners? I mean, not follow the procedures that they normally would.
Absolutely. I think the work from home is a very good example. You're in a situation where, and it makes the distance even greater between, picking up the phone or asking a colleague with regard to an email that you've just received about checking it out. That's why it's important to have the approval process in place so that people can follow it. You're very much isolated when you're working from home. And therefore, you might think, well, I don't want to worry them with regard to this. I don't want to worry them with regard to that. But I think the pandemic has also put a lot of pressure on businesses, as I say, to keep their head above water, and they have dispensed with their approval processes. But it's actually going to be the business email compromise that could potentially bring the company down because of the losses that are created by these sort of business email compromises. We're seeing a lot of literature now about organized gangs moving into business email compromise. We've seen arrests recently that have been all over social media where they've been showing that they've made $50 to $70 million from business email compromise. It is a very profitable business, but you can stop them with regard to having that approval process, having the ability and the belief that what you should be doing is picking up the phone. But the other thing as well I say is make sure all your employees are very aware of the red flags. They need to be educated with regard to business email compromise. The final thing I'd say is you have to have a culture with about fraud with regard to, I'm not saying that every time you should be thinking about fraud, but in these sort of situations, you have to have the mindset this could potentially be fraud. So it has to become part of the daily routine where you're discussing these sort of things. If it's forgotten about, then mistakes are made.
Right. So those procedures, I mean, there was a survey conducted by IFOL in 2019 before the pandemic, of course, but it emerged then that less than 50% of SMEs have a really stringent approval process for things like paying invoices. So people must concentrate on that, mustn't they, you would say?
Absolutely. And it's not just your small, medium businesses. We have seen businesses where there's a CFO in place, where they haven't actually had an approval process, where they've actually admitted to us, we believed everything in the email because it's come in an email. That's what the fraudsters want you to believe. No, you have to have these approval processes in place to counteract this. Don't make it human. Unfortunately, you have to make it very clinical with regard to business email compromise. You have to have a process in place. You have to adhere to the process despite the pressure from the fraudster. Do not deviate from that. Make sure that you actually reach out, as I say, and actually confirm the details correctly.
And as a crumb of comfort, in terms of your 7 red flags, would you say in all the experience you have, all the frauds you've seen, that those red flags really by and large cover what people need to look out for?
Absolutely. No, that's a very good point. I think if you can understand those 7 red flags very clearly, you will see them unfortunately, you will see them at points with regard to business email compromise. But if you know, I have not seen a case which deviates outside those 7 red flags. They very much capture business email compromise. You know, we have seen new attack vectors that take place where fraudsters may have moved on to WhatsApp with regard to the communication, or Skype, but that's about pressure. That's about pressure in terms of getting you to do the transaction. So it still starts off on email on an email. It may end up with them trying to push you onto Skype because they don't want to speak, but the reality is it starts with regard to the email, but you can finish it off with regard to making sure you make contact properly.
Alex, thanks very much. Lots of good pointers, lots of good examples there. But before we go, if there was one thing that you would tell everyone watching to do immediately to protect themselves and their businesses, what would that one thing be?
I would say go away, review how you deal with transactions, be they business transactions, be they payment to tax firms, whatever it may be, wherever you're communicating with the outside world with regard to money changing hands. Look at what you do now. Do you have an approval process in place? Do you, are you authenticating that transaction? Do you double check that transaction with another person? Do you ensure that you make communication? If you haven't got that in place, you must put that in place. Everything else, with regard to a business email compromise, is great. Learning all about it is great, but you must have that approval process in place.
Alex Beavan, Head of Fraud Investigation, Western Union, thank you very much indeed. And thank you all for joining us. A link to the slide deck will be sent to you, and this webinar will be available on the ACAP website. And the next Western Union ACAP webinar is on the 15th of October at 2 p.m. ET or 7 p.m. UK time, and it's Risk Management for Risky Times, Combating Common Traps for Decision Makers. Brendan McGrath, Director of Corporate Risk Management, North America. So, hope to see you then, but for now, thanks Alex, and thanks for joining us. Goodbye.